We're live, Gordon, and
Okay.
that's a good thing. For those who are joining us at this time, my name is Marvin Rappaport, and I am a longtime member of the board of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Library, which has started a local history project talking to individuals who grew up here, live, work, and played here over the years, and can tell us a little bit about local history from their particular points of view. I'm pleased to be joined by Lynn Skolnick, longtime president of the board of the library, who will be assisting with questions and additions as needed. Today, our guests are brothers who grew up in the Monticello area, and they'll tell us about their history there and their family history, which goes back to the 1800s. And not many people that I've interviewed yet can talk about their family going back that far. So without any further ado, I will say that we have Gordon MacAdam, who's in that gray shirt with the glasses, and Henry MacAdam, also with glasses. And we'll start off with Mac and ask him to tell us when his family arrived in Sullivan County, and then when he and Gordon were born and where, and how they ended up growing up in Sullivan County, in particular in the Monticello area. Mac?
Okay, thank you very much. I certainly wanted to say thanks to the three of you facing me on the screen for allowing me the chance to set the time and the day when we would do this. I think it was very gracious of Marvin to do that rather than try and box in a particular time. So it's certainly convenient for me. I hope it's not inconvenient for any of you. And I also want to thank Marvin for the list of questions that he provided, because as you read through it, it does help to stir the gray cells and perhaps will make things a little more coherent. Gordon and I are city kids, but it didn't last very long and it didn't make much of an impression on us. We were both born in Queens, New York City, during World War II, in rather improbable circumstances, because both our father and our mother had previous marriages and children, and they were middle-aged by the time we came along. Why they decided on that is still a mystery, but we are here and making the most of it. So we lived there only a few years. I was born in 1942 and Gordon in 1945. We moved to Monticello in 1946 when both of our parents found employment in Monticello, and with a house already provided, that was a smooth transition and one that could be planned.
What did they do? What did they do for work?
Our father, James, that's the Scottish side of the family, was, as far as we can tell, a self-made engineer. He worked at the time he met my mother in New York City at the Pierre Hotel in New York, a rather big place, and I think close to Central Park. He did all the heating and air conditioning, and I signify the latter of that, which was new by World War II. For that hotel, and he met my mother under rather odd circumstances. He was looking for a place to rent a room, and she happened to have an extra room, so they got together that way. My mother was a nurse for just about all of her life, a licensed practical nurse. The two of them were able to find employment in Monticello because there was something called the American Steam Laundry back in the late 1940s on St. John Street, long gone. I think it disappeared by the 1960s. My father found employment there, and my mother found employment at what was then the Hamilton Avenue Hospital. Some of you old timers may remember it. That was a very handy situation. But we moved into a house on Rose Valley Road, much older than our parents, much older than the people who were living there at the time in the late 1940s. It was a house first built in the 1840s. Our family didn't come into possession, my mother's side of the family, the Irish side, until the 1860s. or actually 1870s. That house where we grew up next year, as Gordon can tell you, is going to turn 150 years in terms of just our family owning it. There's still a previous 30 or 40 years when it belonged to earlier Irish settlers there. So the house goes back quite a ways. Gordon, do you want to pick up on this point in terms of the Irish side of our family in Sullivan County?
Yeah, when they came, our great grandparents came to Jeffersonville and Coshocton Center, and when we did our family history, which was the first project that we actually ever worked on together. We found our great grandfather buried behind St. George's Roman Catholic Church in Jeffersonville. And then the family migrated. Actually, what happened is he passed away. They had 7 children in Jeffersonville. Both of them were illiterate, and we know that by Mac researching the census records, because back in the day you had to check off a box if you could not read or write. So we knew both of them were illiterate, and he worked in the tannery in Jeffersonville. They had 6 or 7 kids, and then as the years went by, then he passed away, and she, as a widow, still had 2 children at home, and they bought the 65 acres that we still live on in 1874.
Can I step in just a moment in terms
Sure.
of background? What prompted the Irish side of our family to come to Sullivan County was the potato famine in Ireland in the 1850s. The prompt for the Scottish side of our family, which we can get to later on, was not that. It was poverty.
Right.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Right. So the contiguous to us, the 65 acres that we own today, that we've had since 1874, was 500 acres, which is now the development of Melody Lake, if you're familiar with that. And on the old maps, it was Toohey Pond, Toohey. That was our great grandfather. And he lived there with his wife and 11 children, and typical Irish family. And he had a boarding house where boarders came up on the train after the train came through Sullivan County in 1871, right, Mac?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
the train went right through his property, which was handy.
Yeah. And he had quite an enterprise there. He had a large boarding house, which he advertised with the railroad. He had a sawmill and the farm. So it was a very busy place. And then our mother, who spent a lot of time growing up in Monticello and Philadelphia, moved to New York because there were some other relatives there, and married her first husband, which was Olson, had 2 children, but Olson died before the second child was even born, leaving our mother with 2 little kids to raise. And she raised them until they were adults when she met our father, okay, and then had 2 children with him. When I was born in 45, my mother was 41. So she was old enough technically to be our grandparents, and old certainly for having children back in that day in 1945.
Well, Dad was 52 when you were born.
Yes. So when we moved to Monticello on Rose Valley Road, my mother had inherited that property from our grandfather, her father, and our namesake, Henry Gordon Doherty. That's who we were named after. And Henry Gordon had it from 1919. When he died in 1936, my mother inherited it, even though she was living in New York. So they did use it during the summertime, and that's how after she remarried and they decided to move there. She had been coming there for a number of years. And we were very fortunate, but the circumstances on Rose Valley Road at that time in 1946, they just got electric and phone because everything stopped a half a mile up the road at the Barth boarding house. It was a boarding house and small farm. And that family would become central to Henry and I as young kids, because the circumstances living at home, what happened was, to my mom now, is our father died in 1951. Okay, so I'm 5 and Henry is 7.5 or whatever, leaving her again with 2 small children and a low paying job. Okay, so circumstances at home were tight in terms of having anything extra or money. And during the winter time, and back in those days, and for those of us who've lived here, we're not making it up, we had some really cold spells in the winter in January where it was below freezing for a week or more. And our heat in the house, which was only kerosene heaters and a fireplace, was not adequate. So there were a number of times where our water froze up, okay, in the house. And temporarily at times, what Mac and I would do is we would take a sleigh with 2 big milk cans on it, if you're familiar with them, and pull it up the road to the boarding house, to our neighbors, a half a mile, and fill them up, and then bring it back home. And we put one milk can in the kitchen and 1 milk can in the bathroom. So when you got up in the morning, you put a stopper in the sink in the bathroom, little bitty stopper, and you heated a pan of water up on the gas stove in the kitchen, and you took water out of the milk can and put that into the sink, and then you added enough hot water to get it warm enough so that you could wash up and so forth.
I can add something that's even a little more primitive here, because my memory just about takes it in. I don't think Gordon's does. We came up from the city to Monticello in the summers. At least I did at first, before Gordon was born and before we moved there permanently. So we're talking about 1942 through 1946, when there was no electricity at the house and no indoor plumbing. We had one of those wonderful, wonderful outdoor privies to use while we were there, and
Right.
a spring behind the house that had been dug and used by our predecessors from the 1870s until then to carry water up to the house. So when we moved in and electricity was installed and we had indoor plumbing, it was like the Ritz. Quite a difference. Go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah, so at any rate, that was basically the circumstances there. And then later, when around 1958, our mother was able to get central heat put in the house. So from that point on, which was put in by Sears and Roebuck, we were able to have central heat, and circumstances were a lot better. But we literally, that family up the road that I mentioned, the Barth family, and we actually wrote a story about that family because they took us in several times when we couldn't get the water back on. We could only do the milk can thing temporarily. We had to literally move into the boarding house. That family allowed us to come there several times and live, and then we would walk to school from there, which was a half mile closer to the bus stop that we had to walk to.
And I should add a note in the small world situation that the farm the Barth family lived on since the 1930s had belonged again to my mother's family in the 1870s and 1880s, at least until they took possession of it later on. So
right, that was 100 acres. So Yeah,
They were,
the
they were
family
in,
actually owned close to 800 acres at one time on Rose Valley Road.
exactly. And I should also add in terms of primitive, when we moved there in 1946, Rose Valley Road was two dirt ruts with grass growing down the middle. It was the first road it connected to that had any kind of surface was Cold Spring Road. Sorry, South Woods Drive in one direction and Cold Spring Road in the other direction. So we saw nothing but dirt for the first almost 10 years that we were there. I think, Gordon, it wasn't really surfaced until Melody Lake opened and started to function
Yes,
as a second home area for people from New York City.
right, which was
That
53,
led to
54.
the
Yeah.
road being widened and paved. It also made a difference in terms of school, in terms of how we got to school. Gordon could tell you about that because we walked.
Yeah, when in our early years going to Monticello schools, while the school had centralized and the one-room schoolhouse that was on Southwoods Drive, a little over a mile and a half from our house, that had been closed, but they did not have central bus pickup, door-to-door pickup. So, and this was common. People around our whole area in Sullivan County, you had to walk to a bus stop. And with us, it was a mile and a half away at the intersection with Southwoods Drive. And the school put up a little wooden shanty there for inclement weather. And the kids that were lived close by around us all walked to that central collection area, and the bus picked you up there. So we did that for the first number of years. I think we were I was probably in 6th or 7th grade when they finally started door-to-door pickup. And a guy by the name of Ralph Myers in Monticello, who had a taxi cab company, we actually had a station wagon that came and picked us up because there were so few kids that lived in our area. They picked us up and then went into Forestburg and picked up Bill Sipos and some of the Toomey kids right near your house where you live, Marvin. Jack McCormick. So they didn't need a bus. It was just 6 or 8 kids, and we piled into the station wagon every morning and every night. So
remember
that's
the
the
name?
way.
Remember the name of the other kids in your neighborhood that were on that wagon?
Yeah, there were very few. There was on Rose Valley Road in the very early years, the 2 kids that were roughly 10 years older than us, the Barth boys, Herbert and Walter, they walked with us. They were the big kids walking out to the corner. And by the time the bus started, they were gone to college. And there was one other kid, Bob Lavender, who lived right near the boarding house. And that was it on Rose Valley Road.
Right.
So
I think, yeah, there was a family called Price, but I think they lived close enough to Southwoods Drive where the kids there just simply walked a quarter of a mile, probably. I don't remember them on the bus.
no, right.
Okay, now you got us on the bus, and you said you went to school, but you didn't tell us where you went to school. Did you both go to the same school, and what was that like?
Yeah, we both went to what became Monticello Central School. The old high school building at that time was already 20 years old. It had been built in the Depression as a WPA project, and attached to it was the 1896 school, which was then complete when it was built. It only went for 8 grades.
Bedford Avenue School.
So those two were combined. So Gordon and I went through the whole 6th grade, 7 if you count kindergarten, grade school system, and then we just walked down the hallway into the high school, well, the junior high, and then high school portion of it in the late 1950s or 60s.
Yeah, but where did you go
Actually,
for 1 to 6?
Right,
Well,
right there in Monticello.
Well,
Oh,
The
so
no,
you-
the rural school closed during World War II.
but we
so the
started
Barth-
in the telephone building. I went to the telephone building, which was next door. It's still, the telephone building is still standing.
Which
And
was
upstairs,
overflow.
Monticello School had rented the upstairs of that building, and they had first grade, second grade, third grade in the telephone building. And then I came to the Bedford Avenue School, which was fourth, fifth, and sixth, and then into middle school, seventh, eighth, and ninth.
I started out at Bedford Avenue, and one of the nice transitions was from being a kid who had lived at home all the time to the first day in kindergarten was that my teacher was also my aunt.
Great.
Eleanor O'Donnell from Sackett Lake. I don't know, Lynn. She was at the school long enough. Maybe you have a recollection, or Marvin. She taught until
that was way before Lynn's time.
Okay. She taught kindergarten until the 1960s when she retired.
Yeah, 30
So
years.
it was a nice smooth transition for me. And so I did all kindergarten and then 1 through 6 in the oldest portion of the school building. Then I transferred to the what is now, well, what became the high school, and then later on the middle school in Monticello, and did grades 7 and 8 separately, and then did grades 9 through 12 before I graduated in 1960.
Do you remember your teachers, either one of you, from kindergarten to 6?
Well,
any names?
Yeah, I don't think Gordon and I had the same teacher for any of those grades. Go ahead, Gordon, and see if you remember.
Yeah, I had Mrs. Bell.
Yep.
Her husband owned Bell's Garage on in Monticello. I had Mrs. Will, Mrs. Bertholoff. Let's see.
We did have one the same. Once I got out of kindergarten with my aunt Nora O'Donnell, I had Sadie Gremerson, and then I had someone named Mrs. Stone. I don't know if anyone remembers her. The youngest, by the way, we had all female teachers, but up until we got into middle school, and I had Mrs. Usner for 4th grade.
Yes,
she was young and just starting out in the system. Mrs. Baileyguard was older. I had her, I think, for 4th grade. I had someone named Mrs. O'Neill for 6th grade. So it's possible we did have one teacher that overlapped with us.
Yeah.
I had some of those same teachers. Lynn didn't go to school here as a youngster, but I did. I went to the to the phone building for kindergarten and 1st grade. And then in 2nd grade, Mrs. Kyle was already over in the Bedford Avenue building. And I had Miss Usner and Mrs. Bertholoff and Mrs. O'Neill, before we ended up going in. So we can relate to all that entailed in their classes.
Absolutely.
I think what happened with the telephone building, the school, remember, and what we learned in doing the one-room schoolhouse project is they didn't close all of the one-room schoolhouses at one time. That's what I thought when we first started the project. But they closed them one at a time over a period of years. So what was happening, and that's probably why Mac did not go to the telephone building, but in the ensuing couple of years before I got there, they were closing other one-room schools, and they had to bring the teachers and the kids in and have space for them to teach. So they probably rented the telephone building. And because the latest school, which was Rock Hill, was not closed until 1960. 60.
I think, yeah.
Okay, so you touched on something. Let's take a little side trip. By the way, Gordon, when you raise your hand, you cover the camera. You guys did a study of one-room schoolhouses. We're going to get to it later, but as long as you're talking about it, could you give us a 30,000-foot view on how many one-room schoolhouses there were? And it's not just Monticello. You did Sullivan County, the whole county?
No.
Town of Thompson only.
Town of Thompson only.
Of course, for those who may not know, Town of Thompson is probably the largest township in terms of population and geographic area, going to Sackett Lake, going towards Kimeisha, going out Old Liberty Road and so forth,
Yeah.
and St. John Street, which became Cold Spring Road. So it went out in lots of different directions. How many one-room schoolhouses did you find? And if any tidbits with respect
Well,
to that?
Gordon again was the spark plug for this, just like he was for our family history. And he and I both guessed, I think at first there might have been 12 schools. And as he'll tell you, there turned out to be 20 one-room schools.
And that's when we realized, when we finally got which became our Bible, the 1874 map of the town of Thompson, which indicated where all the schools were. And when we saw 20, we realized that that project was beyond the scope of just the two of us, because now you're talking about doing title searches to establish when these places came into being, when they were sold, who bought them, how much was paid for them, all kinds of information on those deeds. So one of the first people that we brought into the to form our committee, the one-room schoolhouse committee, was Mary Ann Barons, who has her own title search business. And she actually, Mac says, I hoodwinked her into doing all of those title searches. But I knew Mary Ann for a number of years, and doing 20 title searches where you have to go back, in some cases, 150 years, and in some cases where these parcels disappeared totally off the maps because they were pulled into larger adjacent parcels. Not an easy thing to do. And then
Gordon,
we
go ahead.
brought in other people. Yes, Lynn.
I was curious, what sparked your interest in? I remember when you came to the library and did a talk on the book of the history of your family. You mentioned how invaluable the resources were at the County Government Center in doing the title searches. Can you just speak to a little bit to the use of the community as part of the research, and what even sparked your interest in, in the projects?
Sparking the interest was easy. When we did our family history, Henry and I were reminded, when we were talking about walking Rose Valley Road, our grandmother, who lived on the adjacent 500 acres, on that farm, we could see the farmhouse basically from where we lived, only it had burned down. But if it had been standing, we could see it. She walked, and the other 10 kids all walked down Rose Valley Road and then made a right and went to the one-room schoolhouse that was there. That building was part of our lives growing up, because they didn't tear it down until 1999 or 2000. So that's what sparked us. We said, wow, our grandmother went, walked to that school. I wonder how many schools there were. And then we went through this process of discovering the 20. To the other part of your question, Lynn, in terms of we were so lucky, because I stayed living here and lived a totally different life than Mac, who went off early and lived out of the country for so many years. But I stayed here like Marvin did, and so many people, and which was great, because when we started doing these projects, it was like knowing Mary Ann as a title searcher, so I could reach out to her. And I knew this person that had expertise in this area and that area. So I was able to pull those people in to form the committee. And then, you have the tremendous cooperation of the Sullivan County Historical Society. When I first went over there, day one, we had been there when we were researching our family book. We started on the schools to find out what information they might have. And they always provided us backup, and Sue Cecil, who's the president now and has been for many years, and some of the other people over there, Fred Fries, just great having them in as your backup as you go through and do this research. So we were fortunate enough to put that committee together. It took us 3 years with the committee to put the project together. And the other people that were so cooperative was the town of Thompson board, Bill Reber as supervisor. I had to go and speak to the town board when we were looking to put up these plaques. Each one of them is $1,300 a piece. They're double-sided cast aluminum. So when you're talking of $1,300 a piece times 20 plaques, you have a few bucks involved. So we needed to get grants, and Henry and I could not apply for grants as individuals to the William Pomeroy Foundation, who now makes all the plaques for New York State up in Syracuse. So in order to do that, you have to be a tax exempt organization or a municipality. So I went and spoke at the town board to ask them if they would partner with us on that part of the project. And so along with that partnership came the grant person at the town of Thompson. And she would automatically, we adopted her onto the committee. And Al Walkoff, our previous town historian, was on the committee, as well as his wife, Judy, who graduated with Mac. So we had some.
We were classmates.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so, you couldn't get any better than to have the town historian and his wife on the committee. And she was a volunteer at Sullivan County Historical Society. So it just all came together very well.
Great. Let me ask this question. You can talk to us about what, if anything, in your elementary school was of particular note, or junior high or high. But before we go there, what was it like walking on Broadway in the early 50s, really, when you guys were of the school age and you were spending time in town either before or after school? The firehouse, for example, was across from the post office, no?
That's right.
Just one example. People don't remember that. What else
Yes.
was different about Monticello in those, it's not going back to the 1800s, but we're talking about in the early, let's say the late 40s or early 50s. What was
Right.
different?
Well,
Diagonal parking.
diagonal parking, and some of the old buildings were still standing. Gordon will tell you, there used to be a Kennedy's candy store on the corner, almost on the corner of Broadway and St. John Street, and a Chinese laundry just down the street from there. Those are all gone. The bank and other things replaced it. But Monticello was booming at the time we were growing up. And the best barometer of that is to look at the sesquicentennial celebration they had in 1954. It was really, really a big deal. And I'm so glad they published so much. Yeah, we missed Gordon.
I think we lost
dropped out.
Gordon all of a sudden. Well, let's just
Gordon
keep
dropped
going.
out.
I think he'll come back. It's my guess.
All right. Well, I'll keep chatting anyway.
Sure.
But Broadway was a magical place to walk up and down. We had two movie theaters, the Rialto and the Broadway Theater farther down, and small hotels that had survived from the 19th century. Some of them had been renamed. Bakeries that were downtown. One of my classmates, Sandy Trattenberg's family, ran something called Trattenberg's Bakery, close to the Roman Catholic Church. And it wasn't until years later that I think Carol is trying to help Gordon fix whatever's happening.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Was Kaplan's there in your early memory?
oh, it was, and it was again. It was part of the magic of Monticello. We could bicycle in from where we lived, 4.5 miles outside of Monticello, with 25 cents in our pocket, bicycle up to the window. You didn't have to go indoors at Kaplan's. They had a street window. For 25 cents, you could get a knish that was as big as, your two hands to hold it. It was a whole meal. It was just fantastic. And, pizza places and whatnot.
Gordon, you have to move the camera a bit, only see your chin. Okay, that's better. Thank you.
Better? Yeah, okay.
And
you're still with us.
Any other stores stand out in your mind? I mean, all the candy stores, well, they were delis. It wasn't just Kaplan's. There were a handful of delis. There were a lot of drug stores. There were mom and pop shops, Berman's and Marsh's, and the women's clothes. And
The big-
Boys
the big-
Town became Men's World and
One
so
of
forth.
the big clothing stores in town, Hammond and Cook, was co-owned by someone in our extended family. The
Ah.
Cook family of Monticello, going back to Judge George Cook, and then down through Lawrence Cook, and then his two sons, one of which was my classmate George. Members of their family ran co-owned and ran Hammond and Cooks, and that was a big deal. That's where you could buy Boy Scout uniforms. And when I was in the Scouts and Gordon was in Cubs, we had to go to Hammond and Cooks to get suited out.
In my day, it was Al Cohen's,
Yes,
which had the
Yes.
sporting goods and various
Cohen
things where you
Sport
could
Shop.
buy. You
Yep.
could
Yep.
buy, if you had enough money, you could buy Converse sneakers for $5. That was like a ton of money.
that
Yeah.
was a
Instead
big
of
deal.
kids. Instead of
And where
kids.
the library is now, that was a hardware store prior to being the library, and
Davco?
yeah,
Well, it was
the
Strauss.
Davidoff
before-
family.
It was Strauss stores before it was Davco.
Right.
Yes,
And we knew the family who worked there. Abe was someone that we grew up with.
Abe Davidoff. Yeah.
yes,
And there is a history of the Davidoff family and the history of the building on the kiosk outside of the present library location now.
I'm
right.
glad for that. Yeah.
Okay. So now we can move on to schooling. Is there anything about elementary school that stands out? I guess you're not in sports and you didn't have, competitions and kinds of things leading into the sixth grade. Maybe from seventh grade on, you were either in clubs or band or music, anything you guys did?
Yeah, one of the novelties, of course, of getting out of elementary school in Monticello was that you began to have male teachers, and that was quite a novelty for a while, and it may have inspired me, I think, later on to teach, not elementary or high school, although I did teach some high school, but to make teaching a profession. Yeah, I got into sports, and that was for me a big thing. And
Mac,
track.
did either you or Gordon, we had just interviewed Bob Kaiser, did either of you have him as a math teacher when you went through school?
Mac
I did, certainly. He was one of my inspirations for that. And in fact, I think of all the high school teachers I had, it was probably Bob Kaiser and what was the
social
science
studies.
physics teacher?
Bernie
Bremen School.
Jacobs.
No,
Bernie
I
Jacobs.
had Bernie Jacobs for
History.
history, but I
Bremen
had
School?
Bremen School for chemistry and for
Bert
physics.
Bremenstuhl?
Hmm?
Yeah.
Phil,
Bert Bremenstuhl?
yeah, and he was inspirational in a different sort of way, because he made physics, which was not particularly of interest to me, and chemistry interesting, just because of the way he approached them. But Kaiser was the overall best because he had the personality, the no nonsense approach, and I think he actually enjoyed teaching math, especially higher
yeah.
math. He actually got a kick out of doing that.
Did
So
you
that-
play?
that-
You play for Coach Somerville? What sports did you play?
Yeah, I was more toward track and cross country rather than baseball or tennis or well, there was no football team back then.
Right.
And but the sport that I really excelled in and the one that I enjoyed the most, unfortunately, turned out to be the short-lived sport, and that was swimming. When I was in high school, Monticello had a swim team. We used the Olympic pool at the Concord Hotel. They bussed us over to use that. I think my time with the team lasted about a year and a half, when I was probably a sophomore and a beginning junior in high school. It's the one sport I really did well in. And in terms of those days, I'd like to think Muhammad Ali, the late Muhammad Ali, and I were exactly the same age. He was thinking in the late 1950s of the coming 1960 Olympics in Rome. He did better than I did, because they didn't take his sport away. I had actually thought that, and the coach at the time said, maybe we can give you some special training and this and that. Someone at the high school got into a quarrel with the swimming instructor at the Concord Hotel, and it developed into, I guess, a standoff. And finally, the owners of the Concord Hotel said, "We're just closing off the pool to the high school. We will
Wow.
not." And the swim team went away in
But
about
as-
1959.
And as Matt can tell you later in our little story here, he went on to become a pretty decent scuba diver and actually worked on some archaeological scuba diving off of the coast of Greece, off the coast of Crete,
No,
in later years.
Cyprus.
Cyprus, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah. So
the
eventually,
swimming
yeah,
did come back.
eventually swimming paid off.
Very interesting. Despite the Concord's misgivings.
Yeah.
How about in high school? Anything particular stand out among your experiences there, either teachers or any other clubs, music, band,
I was in band,
chess? Yeah,
and I played clarinet. Arnold Hughes was the band director at that time,
right.
who really had his hands full. He really could have benefited by having some assistance, even if it was part-time.
He taught every
he did the
instrument,
best he
right?
could. Huh?
He taught every instrument.
Every single instrument, and he had to sit through those 15 or 20 minutes a week with every single student in band to keep them on track. But I enjoyed it a lot. We got to travel a bit because of that, and of course I traveled with the sports. Both the track team and the cross country team did inter-school events.
And back in the day, when you were in band, Mac, they actually had a marching band and you had uniforms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have the pictures to prove it.
Yeah.
Great.
So
now you're getting ready to get out of high school, you guys. And how do you figure out what are you going to do next? And is it related in any way to any of your, I should ask, did you work at any of the hotels or resorts during the summers in your high school years or shortly thereafter?
I certainly did. I worked for a grocery store in 1955, the Victory store.
Right.
I think when it had first moved from St. John Street to the top of Monticello Hill.
Right.
And then I had worked, I caddied at the Concord Hotel a couple of summers during high school. That was a big deal because I got $10 for 9 holes of golf.
Whoa.
And $10 then you have to multiply by 10. That was $100 worth of spending. And if I caddied 18 holes and got $20, I felt wealthy. That was really nice. And of course, knowing people in the caddy shack, I got free passes to the shows at the Concord stage. So part of my growing up was watching George Jessel and Eddie Cantor and Martin and Jerry Martin and Lewis, and all the many of them had been vaudeville before they went to TV in the 1950s. And in summers, they came up to Monticello, of course, to ply their trade at a place like the Concord. So I felt very, very grateful.
Speaking of TV, when did you get one out in Rose Valley Road, and what kind of reception did you have, if any?
Oh, yeah.
Gordon can tell you. Not many channels.
No, you had 2, 4, 2, 4, 5, and sometimes 7 was pretty snowy. And we had an antenna up on the roof, and Mac and I would depending on what happened with the weather, wind blowing or whatever, one of us would have to go up on the roof and turn the antenna, and the other guy would be down looking at the TV until the picture came in because it would get out of kilter. So yeah, that was the early TV, and a lot of people experienced that. And one thing I just wanted to drop back to, if I could, on on grade school for me and junior high and teachers is I was extremely lucky to have Milton Burley, not Milton Berle, Milton Burley, who you probably knew. And I had him for 7th and 8th grade wood and metal shop. And I didn't know it at the time, but this guy was going to, in years later, was going to change my world. And because he had started an innovative program at Monticello at the time, the work study program, and where kids who were identified as possibly maybe not finishing out high school, they were able to, through Milt's effort, set up a program where you could go to school half a day and work half a day. And because of my circumstances, and I'll just say this, that I got married at 17 and had 4 children by the time I was 22. Most people don't do that. Mac led a little different life and didn't even get married until 32, I think you were, Mac. So 30, okay. And so Milt Burley had this program, and in my senior year, I only needed 3 classes in order to graduate, and I got a Regents diploma. And they were able to reschedule my classes so that I could take them in the morning. And then through his efforts, I was already working as a stock boy at Dyke Shopwell. You may not have heard that name in a while. And in the meantime, through Burley's efforts, I got a job as an assistant draftsman at Greenwald Suppan Air Conditioning and Heating at 116 Broadway, where the furniture place is now. And through that job, I was able to go to school half a day, work for Greenwald Suppan half a day, and then I still kept my job at Dyke Shopwell. I worked there Thursday and Friday nights and Saturdays. So I worked a total of about 80 hours a week. And so it was a busy schedule. But, you know, when you're married and you have children, you got to make some bucks. So that's the way I was able to do it. But Milt's program, because of that job at Greenwald Suppan, and I was able to advance myself within 4 or 5. I was there 14 years total until they went out of business. But after the first 4 or 5 years, I was able to advance myself. I became the senior draftsman and job coordinator. And we were doing commercial jobs, schools, hospitals, and office buildings all up and down the Hudson Valley. Okay. And IBM was moving in big time to Kingston, Poughkeepsie, Fishkill, and they couldn't build the schools fast enough. So with that job came good wages. And because of keeping that job for 14 years, my first wife, Joyce, and I, and the 4 kids were able to build a new house on our family property between 1968 and 69. And it gave my kids a whole different lifestyle than what Mac and I knew. And actually, Mac was home from Beirut, Lebanon, in when I was building the house, and he was staying in my mom's house. She had passed away, and he was staying in the house across the street from where I was building.
That was the summer of 1968.
Yes, and he thought that he was going to be coming home and kind of taking it easy for the summer. And I had him up at 6 o'clock in the morning mixing cement and carrying lumber for the new house across the street. And he literally spent the whole summer with me doing that because we built the house ourselves with my father-in-law and so forth over a period of 2 years.
It's called family slave labor, and I never really recovered from it.
Yeah, but
Right.
Gordon, you piqued our interest. How did you, Mac, end up in Beirut?
It was a very circuitous route. It's I did it through the military. Actually, I was in
You
the
finished high
military
school and went into the military, or did you
No,
go to
no, no,
college?
no, no. First, no. When I got to my junior year at Monticello High, we all had to have a little heart to heart with the what was the person called then?
Guidance counselor?
The guidance counselor about what you were going to do with your life in the future. I was a very mediocre student. I barely had a 70 average at that time. And the guidance counselor, I can't remember the name now. I think
Was that Mr. Kurlander?
I think it might have been Kurlander.
Uh-huh.
But whoever it was took a look at my grades and said, I think trade school would be a great idea for you. Think about that, or just getting a job, and don't worry about college. And to my surprise, they were correct at first, because I had no idea what I wanted to do. Many of my classmates were applying just as a guarantee of acceptance to Orange County Community College. In those days, if you had a passing average, you could at least get in there and get started. This was a decade before Sullivan County Community College came along. So I applied and I got rejected at Orange County. I think I was the only person at Monticello High School who ever got rejected. And it was only by a chance talk with one of our neighbors in the South Woods named Panchison that the State University of New York at Delhi came up. And he said to me, you know, all you have to do is pass an entrance exam. They don't care what your average was or what your potential might be, or this or that. Try and get in there because it's tuition free. So I went up the summer after graduation and took the entrance exam and passed. And I spent 2 years there, also learning that what I had applied for, I was not going to be doing the rest of my life. And that was construction business. It was the one thing on the list of courses there that I thought I might take and that I could make something of. But it turned out that it didn't. But while I was there, I met a very interesting professor who retired the year I graduated from Delhi, and he was moving to Mexico. And he went blind in one eye, and he said, can you help me move to Mexico? It's going to be a little tough to do this. And I did. And that opened up a big world of first travel. I had never been outside the US before that. And, you know, he had been a teacher, and I had admired his teaching style. And I thought, maybe I can combine some love that I had of, you know, teaching. I couldn't do any worse than the worst of my teachers, and I might do as well as some of them. And like Bob Kaiser. And so after a year working for the Times Herald Record newspaper in Middletown, I got drafted. I was 21. I was still single. I wasn't enrolled in college. And in those days, you got a draft notice. And I had no excuse not to take advantage of it. There was no Vietnam War at the end of 1963 and the beginning of 1964. So I thought, wow, this is a chance to get in, learn something while I'm in, which turned out to be nursing, and have advantage of the GI Bill. And that got me overseas to Britain with the US Air Force. And while I was in Britain, I took a trip to the Middle East because I had always been interested in that area of the world in ancient times. And that's when I found out about this wonderful American institution called the American University of Beirut. And when I got out of the military with the GI Bill, that's where I went. Now, Gordon.
Yeah, let me just back up a little bit on Matt and our circumstances, because when he got out of high school and was going to go to Delhi, which was an ag and tech school, it was not a state university at the time, and there was no money at home, none, for him to go to college. So when my mother and I took him to Delhi, we didn't drop him off at the dorm or the university. We took him to a local farm near the school. And that's where he lived and worked, on that farm. He got up early in the morning before he went to his classes. And when he came home, he worked at them. And when I took him to Beirut many years later, when he was going to Beirut, I drove him to New York, okay, and all he had with him was an old steamer trunk that we had taken out of my mom's attic, full of his stuff and his books. And I put him on what was that back in the day called a tramp steamer. And it was a cargo ship that took limited passengers. And the reason that he went that way was because that's what he had to do from a money standpoint.
But also therein hangs another tale of coincidence. When I applied to the American University of Beirut, the year after I got out of the military, I never got a response back. So I thought I had been rejected. But I had also applied to something called Roberts College in Istanbul, Turkey, at the same time. And I got accepted. So the cargo ship agency that Gordon talks about in Brooklyn that I booked passage on was going to take me to Istanbul. About 4 or 5 days before the ship sailed, I got a letter from the registrar at the American University of Beirut saying, "We sent you a letter of acceptance, but we never heard back. Are you coming or not?" And I thought, well, of the two places, that was my first choice. So I guess I sent a telegram at that point to the registrar saying, yes, I'm coming. And I had to get on the phone, Gordon will tell you this, and talk to the Turkish agent in Brooklyn and say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to withdraw from the cabin I booked on your ship and look for another one because I'm going to Beirut. He said, no problem. The boat, she stops in Beirut before Istanbul. Just get off. So there I was.
That's terrific.
At any rate, I can tell you that those letters that Mac has after his name of PhD, he earned them the hard way. That's for sure. But anyway, going back to the school thing, I mean, our recollection, I think Mac agrees, of being in Monticello High School and growing up in Monticello are just the greatest. We had lots of friends, both of us. And even though we rode our bike back and forth from Rose Valley Road, and we had different jobs. Mac worked drove truck for Heck's Bakery, which was a going concern at the time. He also worked on the garbage truck for the village of Monticello.
That was the high point of my life.
Yes,
of my working life.
exactly.
I went to work for the village of Monticello the summer after I graduated from high school. They gave me a garbage truck, an assistant. I had Art Solomon, the son of the Solomon family, who owned the Miss Monticello Diner. He was my sidekick on the truck, and we were allowed to go to the county jail in Monticello and pick up low-grade prisoners, guys who were just vagrants and whatnot, no real criminal record, and they could get work leave during the day, and off we went on that garbage truck. That was really the peak of my career.
Yeah.
Gordon, let me ask you a question. Having stayed here and raised your family here, your 4 kids, could you compare? You said you had a great childhood. You loved growing up in Monticello. Would you say that was the same for your 4 kids?
Yes, I do, because again, they grew up in a brand new house with all of the conveniences, and between my wife and I, they were involved. You had all 4 of them in your classroom. They were involved in, as Mac and I were, in sports, but they were in cross country skiing, and my son in baseball, soccer. We were involved in Little League, scouting with them. So they had, and I've talked to my kids about that, what they thought about their childhood growing up, and they think they had absolutely the best situation. We had a good home situation, and
that was my perception as well when I had them in school, that they were all happy, well adjusted, and involved in what the school had to offer at the time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my wife and I urged them to be involved in things, particularly sports, because I thought that was important for them to be involved in. In the meantime, they got in. They were all, thank goodness, in the honor society and played instruments and just did really well. And as you know, Lynn went on to have some pretty decent careers.
Yep.
Tell us their names, Gordon.
Cindy, the oldest, is a nurse practitioner here in Monticello since 1984. She graduated Monticello in 80, so she's been a nurse practitioner since 80. And the next is Debbie. She and her husband started a investment and financial business in Goshen, right, which they had for about 35 years. They just sold that like 2 years ago. And so she's somewhat semi-retired, although she's still working for she, her husband, and the kids, the two of their kids are still working for that company that they sold out to. And then my daughter Brenda, the third one, she is in Boston, and she is with Ernst and Young since she graduated from Pace University in 1987. She's got like 35 years with Ernst and Young. She's been a senior partner for 21 years, and she will be retiring, as the other two girls will, in the next couple of years. And my son is down in Richmond, Virginia, for 25 or more years now. He and his wife have their own insurance business down there and 4 grown children. So we're an extremely lucky family with all of us, with Mac's children and grandchildren. And Mac's granddaughter just started at Pace University, where we've had 4 of our family go already.
That's great. That's wonderful. Thank you. Mac, I'd like you to tell us perhaps about your kids, and if you could, but you touched a nerve, Gordon, for me when you said Mac worked for Hecht's Bakery. My father, Leo Rappaport, worked for Hecht's Bakery in I want to say 39 probably, and met my mom, Rose Rapp, was then Rose Schecht, at the Delano Hotel, delivering rolls from Hecht's, and they got married within a year. But it was all the Hecht's Bakery truck that got them together. So he's touched a nerve in a good way for us. Mac, how about your family? You might as well.
I'll be right back.
Sure.
I will get to that. I will get to that in a moment. Hecht's Bakery, by the way, when I worked for it in 1960, had a number of Hungarian refugees working as bakers in the back. I would have to drive the truck to the part of Hecht's where you picked up the baked goods and then distributed them to the bungalow colonies and that.
They were on Landfield Avenue at that point already?
Landfield Avenue.
Next to Rourke's.
On the right-hand side as you're heading toward the synagogue.
Right next to Rourke's.
Yes, right next to Rourke's. Yeah. And that was another aspect of life that was very coincidental, that got me thinking about living outside the US. Was talking to those Hungarian refugees. They had fled in 1956 when the Soviet army moved into Budapest. And so I feel lucky that way as well. I have 2 daughters, both of them in their 40s. One manages a small theater, community theater, near Washington, D.C. Her husband works for NASA at the Greenbelt, Maryland Center.
Her name is?
Her
name is?
Her name is Sean, and it's the Irish spelling SIAN rather than SEAN. And the other daughter, Cara, lives in Holland. If I say Amsterdam, everyone will think of upstate New York. Sorry, she lives in Amsterdam, Holland, and works for an international agency that sets up secondary school programs along the British system of 13 years. And her boyfriend works for FedEx International. So
both of those children were born
in enjoying life in Holland.
They were born in Beirut, huh?
Both of those children are born in Beirut, right? And they speak, read, or write a number of languages. Actually, Cara did some interpretation work, I think, for interpreting work for the didn't she for Mac for the UN at one point. But they were born in Beirut, and actually, when they went to school, they had a line down the middle of their paper, and on one side they did it in English and the other side in Arabic. And when you sang a nursery rhyme like Old MacDonald, they sang it in English and they sang it in Arabic, and so they learned the language phonetically. As kids
they had an interesting upbringing. Unfortunately, it was in the middle of a civil war in Lebanon, but we survived.
Right. Mac was evacuated twice.
To the U.S., when we got back to the U.S., they were able to readjust. So
I suspect they learned French too, no? Being in Beirut?
Yeah, true.
Mm-hmm. Beirut being the Paris of the Middle East at one point.
It used to be. Yes,
yeah.
It used to be. It ain't now, unfortunately.
Guys, we're closing in on about an hour, and I know there's much more that we could talk about. I'd like to sort of wind up, if we could, though. You haven't told us much about your own lives in more recent years and your spouses, and we'd like to know that too, but maybe we could do a second visit with you. Let's go back to the idea of what it was like growing up here. One of the things we've heard from people, I've heard, is there was a certain diversity about life at Monticello with all the resorts and all the people, as you mentioned, whether it's the bakers or whether the people that came up in the hotels, that the diversity of life, black and white, different faiths, different backgrounds, was a thing that helped them in their travels and in their respective vocations. Can you speak to what it was like growing up here and how one of you ended up on the other side of the world and the other ended up with a business that grew and thrived here locally and sort of grew from there? How did growing up in Monticello and here in Sullivan help you to become the people that you are now, each of you?
I'll speak to that first if you want, Mac. I think exactly what you're saying, Marvin, is the diversity that we had in school with blacks and whites. And, unfortunately, back in that day, we didn't really realize the discrimination that went on. We didn't see very many black faces on TV or doing commercials. But I can tell you, speaking basically for my class graduating in '63, that we just didn't have any problems between the black and white students. If it was a personality thing, it was one thing, but it was never a black and white thing. And also going to, a lot of people have said to me when they've heard I grew up in Monticello and they know of the Borscht Belt. And I said to them, yeah, probably 80% of my classmates were Jewish. And Henry will tell you to this day that when he comes up here, because of going to bar mitzvahs and bas mitzvahs and so forth as kids, and being around a lot of their families as we visited, that we assimilated into that, to the Jewish food in particular. And we get bagels with lox and cream cheese on every visit. Okay, that's an absolute must. And we just never ever found it an issue with the predominance of Jewish families that lived here. And it was just really fun. We both had wonderful friends that we still have.
I concur with Gordon. Absolutely. Yiddish was kind of a second language for the Goyim who grew up in Monticello. And thinking of my Irish ancestry, if any of those of the grandparent or great-grandparent level had ever been around to see how Monticello developed from a very, very white society in the 19th century and very early 20th century into a multicultural place. Is one of my high school classmates was a Cuban refugee, Fabio Carrion. He was unfortunately killed in Vietnam shortly after he was drafted. But that someone came into school not even speaking English at all at first, and managed to graduate and and go on. So yeah, I think that was very important.
Yes.
Well, if we can ask you guys to put a pin in it, as my old law professor used to say, so that we can come back to it, maybe we can invite you for another visit. I just want to say
Love
on
to.
behalf of Lynn and myself and the Crawford Public Library, we didn't even ask you if you guys spent time in the Crawford Library growing up. You know,
We
I'm
did.
sure it
We
was
did.
available to you.
In fact, don't tell anyone, especially Lynn. Don't tell her. I found a book from the old Crawford Library when I came back to Monticello, I think in the mid-1960s, and I was too terrified to, return it and get a bill that I'd need a credit card to pay. But that summer, the library issued we don't ask, don't tell.
An
If you have a
amnesty.
library book, whatever century it might have been in our library, bring it back and we won't fine you. And they did.
Great.
And interestingly enough, Mac, Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library, as well as most libraries around the country, have now suspended fines on overdue books and have not seen an appreciable delay in getting them back. So
That's wonderful. I love that old library.
Mac, where are you located? We didn't ask you. I know Gordon is still in the home front, but where are you?
My wife and I live in central New Jersey, near Trenton, a place called Robbinsville.
Okay,
We've been here for
Well-
quite some time.
great. Well, we hope we can still see you when you come home and visit. And Gordon, we appreciate everything you're doing. On another time, you'll tell us about the Hackle Dam project,
Yeah,
which
we've
is
got a
very
number of
interesting.
projects.
And we can focus on that. On behalf of the library and Lynn and myself, thank you guys for spending time with us. It's we wish you well. In my family, we wish people a happy and healthy New Year this time of the year. So
That's
we
a
wish that for you, and going forward, continued good health and good times for you and your families. Thank you so much.
Thanks to both of you,
Thanks.
and we consider it an honor to be asked, and we appreciate the time.
Not just the time, but again, the flexibility on your parts to do it today at this hour. Much
As you can
appreciated.
tell,
our pleasure.
it's our
Thank you.
pleasure. Bye
All
now.
right. Bye-bye.
So
Okay,
long.
bye-bye.